you're definitely, you would have to, as I'm finding over here, that it is, that light is shining. Yeah. So yeah, it's not going to block out the slides for people to see, I don't think. Let me see if I sit in the middle if it changes. Yeah, it would be uncomfortable for anyone that were sitting. And you're saying over from where you're sitting, you're not really getting that light.
No, this is huge.
Okay.
What do you think? Do you think it's worth like 5 minutes of discomfort and then we'll put it off?
I don't want to do that.
Okay, 5
But I didn't want to.
Okay.
You could take care of that. And Shola is doing is occupied with the.
Yeah. No, that'll work.
I'm gonna use this slide, not because the screen cannot get run away, but actually because basically the light is shining on my face. So my light honestly exacerbates the confusion having small tiny eyes. Functionally, for my part, better than anything, but there's a lot of
So you announce where it is.
I'm sure you know this is
So the first part will just go in the order you prescribed, I forgot. But I know the order,
You are the next to last.
right, so I go and then,
And before is Andrea, Jerusha, Pedagogical.
okay,
Two Professor Women, one Professor Man, then you.
all right. And then, and
I start out. I explain what the doctoral program is.
okay,
Then I introduce the panelists in the order they speak.
okay. And then after we give you our presentation, then you will lead. Okay,
I might do the first round of discussion.
okay.
Can you also, maybe at the end of my last point is financial aid and funding. If you don't discuss funding at the very beginning, will you be able to complete the outcome? The funding calculation.
I don't address anything. I don't address.
So you don't deal with funding yet?
Wait a minute.
What the funding for the doctoral program, you talk about that?
I talk about the summer funding and the next year.
Okay, so I'll next year the funding is the doctoral.
Yeah. I mean, everything relates to financial aid. I do the streamlined time schedule that is a result of that summer funding. This is what they can see. Right. I explain that. And since I start out, you know what I did not mention. What
Yeah.
I mentioned, you sort it out.
I don't want to be repetitive if it's already been said. My students have a lot of questions usually about the mechanics of doctoral because it's new to almost everyone
Right,
when they've done it for the first time.
And
So I never assume that
overwhelming.
people already know.
Right.
But there is even funding because not everyone knows that there is funding available.
Right. That makes one program a lot more attractive than
Others.
Yeah.
That is the number one question I get
Right.
from students that haven't already been admitted. Is this funded?
Yeah, no doubt. I still haven't adjusted to the time change yet.
I have.
Yeah, oh good.
Well, I mean, the days are long and it's busy, so even the extra hour is not sufficient.
Right.
But the fall works better for me than the spring.
Does it?
Yeah, I am a wreck in the spring.
Oh, okay.
But
Yeah, see, I'm the other way around. I
Yeah.
feel like by the time the spring comes, I'm like, oh, I'm alive, finally.
When I'm an insomniac by the time I get to the spring. I'm not sleeping enough, so I'm sleeping a few hours. And losing the hour exacerbates that because I need that extra.
Got you. Yeah. Yeah, I actually feel like that the time works well for me in terms of sleep, but just when it starts to, like around 3 o'clock, you start feeling like the day's kind of wrapping up, and I'm not ready.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we're just waiting for.
Maybe it would be better here. I sit here.
Okay.
Oh,
We
in
have
order?
the 3 professors.
do introductions at the beginning.
You said it,
We'll
not
do
me.
introductions at the beginning.
No, I explained the program, and then I do the introduction for the panelists.
Okay, got it.
I was reading something recently. Somebody said something about Prussians, and being particularly stiff about time. But yeah, I don't remember who said it, but
Well,
probably German.
maybe. Well, we also.
Okay, how are you?
This is a very formal setup.
I'm gonna ask you about some Dropbox issues on that for
Okay,
our
just
seminar.
email it to Chris.
Okay.
I sent an email today saying if you're having any trouble, send everything to Chris.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
No,
Yeah, you were not the only one.
really.
And he usually says, send everything to me, and I was like, why? We can just drop it in ourselves. And now it's like,
Yeah, I wasn't able. It doesn't give me an option to add a file or to.
did you try right away, or did you? Because Aaron discovered that it wasn't set up for anybody.
Okay.
Job?
I tried it for the original deadline, and on that day I just.
I don't know when he fixed it.
Okay, I'll try it again.
Try it again.
So I got the
but the
email
email
today,
today
but I didn't
said, email to Crystal Fadden if you have trouble.
Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
So we won't present the paper.
No, read the end of that email.
Right.
I know, a really long email that everybody's reading in advance.
Okay.
And then you're just doing, I think I say, I wrote it so long ago, but I think I say something like you have 5 minutes to do a summary, maybe 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah. To situate the project, you're describing context, why it's a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah, some storytelling,
Okay.
a little abstract or summary of the paper.
Okay.
And then if you want, you can raise, I can't remember if I put this in the email, but you can also use the workshop to your benefits by saying, here are the things I'm struggling with, and that can direct the conversation.
Okay.
Now, the respondents won't necessarily be privy to your questions ahead of time, but the rest of the group all presumably have read your paper.
Gotcha.
And they're really good. In my experience, everyone's good at reading.
Okay.
They'll all, yeah.
So
They'll all honor that.
I have a little reminder for all of us from David Drusha. Just FYI, we're live streaming today so that we have some students interested in the program from outside of Union that couldn't come. So we're doing a live stream, and Keisha reminded me that we do need to remember to use the mics.
Great.
Because even if the room can hear, the live stream won't be able to hear. So
And some of us are only doing Ph.D. applications in general, not
yeah,
Union.
I am going to handle. This is what you apply to Union.
Good, good,
So
good.
you should give general. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, that's exactly what.
That, but I just, this is not what I'm going to talk about. Emotional.
No.
It's reality.
Yes. No, this is a whole reality conversation. And I will also speak the reality of what does it take to apply to PhD. So what do we do? So it's not meant to be emotional.
coming to this panel discussion on why considering applying for a PhD program and how to prepare for it. It's about time. The deadline is approaching fast, December 1st. And before I introduce the panelists, let me give you some basic data about our PhD program here at Union. Oh, the mic, sorry. So, my voice was not heard, so I have to repeat the whole thing?
Yeah.
The whole thing. What? Is it on? I press the button. There is one button. Okay, I do the whole thing again. Well, not so much. Welcome to our panel with the title, Why Considering Applying for a PhD Program and How to Prepare for That. The deadline is approaching very fast, December 1st, so it's about time that you get your stuff together. Before I introduce the panelists, let me give you some basic data about our PhD program at Union. So, in accordance to our profile as a social justice-oriented, progressive, interdenominational institution, we have a very ambitious interdisciplinary PhD program, which means doctoral students have a major field and a minor field, usually, with a major and minor advisor, and the interdisciplinary character of our program is also enhanced by a doctoral seminar for first and second year students. And the doctoral seminar has the claim to organize a kind of interdisciplinary connections by inviting professors here at Union and from abroad. So our PhD program is divided up into 4 periods, namely coursework, first 2 years, comprehensive exams, 4 comprehensive exams, about a year or so. Then comes the dissertation proposal, about 3-4 months or so, and then writing the dissertation. And so how much time would you have for this, for the main thing, writing this dissertation? The general rule is this, and I quote from the PhD handbook, in a typical handbook style. Students can finish the PhD program in 4 to 5 years. They are expected to finish within 7 years. You see, there's a difference. So that's a kind of limit. However, a student who has not defended the dissertation after 7 years may be granted an extension for 1 year at a time and may be renewed up to the 10th year. So you see the maximum is 10 years, but the official limit is 7 years, and then you get extension from year to year. Now, this is the official time frame. But the real time limit in real life is usually dictated by your financial situation. So the problem was, I can say was in the past tense, that the official 7 to 10 years at Union that you are allowed to be in the doctoral program was not very helpful when after 4 years there was no more money. The funding ended, because then you didn't have any funding for writing your dissertation. And that created a lot of problems, because life kicked in, people had to take on a full-time job, and it became longer and longer, the writing process, and often ended in a failure, that they couldn't do it anymore. So there was PhD students mobilized and were supported by the faculty, were supported also then by the administration. And the result of that was that there is now the possibility of applying for a 5th year funding, which is very important, and also to apply for 2 summer fundings, because the funding was always for 9 months, and the summer funding was always a gap. And normally, after coursework, after the 2-year coursework, during the comprehensive exams period, PhD students have the right to apply for a summer funding that needs to be approved by the advisor and then approved by the director of the PhD program and the dean. And that seems to be very, very helpful for the streamlining of the whole process. So the goal is to get the PhD students through the program without you accumulating more debt. And this means to design a time frame that helps students to do the doctoral program within 4 or 5 years. That's our goal. And you got this little leaflet. Oh, you should have some too. Just to be on the same page, literally. Thank you, Shola. So if you look at it, at the bottom of that, you see I made an imaginary time calculation starting August 2020, which would be your start if you get into the program, and then calculating from there. And now let's go back to the main text here. So you start, let's say, in August 2020. You have 2 years of coursework, which ends in May 2022.
So this is all just about Union, right?
We are talking now about Union, the more general. So that's my task to talk about the program at Union. And you will enlarge that then to the whole world or to the university. And then you can apply for the first funded summer, 2022, where it is recommended, that's all a recommendation, that's not mandatory, where you write your comprehensive prospectus, which is an overview over the 4 comprehensive exams that you're going to do. There's a bibliography and research questions and a description and so on. So this is what you should do in that first funded summer, which is in that case 2022. And then from September, you get it, that needs to be approved normally, recommendation early September 2022. Then the recommendation, do 2 comprehensive exams in the fall semester, to do 2 comprehensive exams in the spring semester 2023, which could lead or should lead to you getting your MPhil in May 2023. You see where I am about in the middle of the page. And then comes, if your application gets approved, the second funded summer in 2023, which is hopefully approved in September 2023. And then you are what we call ABD, anything but dissertation. And then there are 2 possibilities. You finish after the 4th year, which would be in May 2024, or you apply for a 5th year, May 2025. So this is about how the time frame, the recommended time frame, is structured. And our goal is to really get the time in the doctoral program down from now maybe, or it was about 7 years to about 5 years, so that you can, that the PhD students can get out of Union without accumulating more debt. So that's the goal. So at the moment we've got 29 PhD students, which means we've got a relatively small doctoral program. And since we are also a small seminary, we can only accept about 4 or 5 new students into the program. And this is a small number, as you can imagine, and the process is very, very competitive. So it's not advisable to put all the eggs in one basket because the basket is really, really very small at Union. So I'm not saying this with the intention to discourage you, but rather to indicate that our discussion today is not just dealing with the PhD program at Union, but with PhD applications in general. The question whether you go for a PhD program or not is ultimately a very fundamental and also existential decision, and it's therefore a pretty difficult one, given the insecurity on the labor market in the academic field. We are confronted with a very complex question in a complex economic and social environment, and I hope that our debate will touch upon the different levels and layers of the problem. So let me introduce the panelists in order of their contributions, and since most of you know them already, I suppose, I may be brief. I start with Professor Andrea White. Andrea is a womanist theologian, executive director of the Society for the Study of Black Religion, co-chair of the Black Theology Group at the American Academy of Religion. She writes, among others, on Karl Barth, Paul Ricoeur, on theological anthropology from a womanist perspective. Next to Andrea, oh, sorry, you're sitting the wrong order. How can you do that? Jerusha T. Rhodes, Associate Professor of Islam and Interreligious Engagement, is a feminist Muslima theologian who published on the concept of pluralism in Muslima theology and on a comparative feminist theology engaging diverse Muslim and Christian feminist, womanist, and Muharista voices. Professor David Carr, Professor of Old Testament, Hebrew Bible. His teaching and research interests include the formation of the Hebrew Bible, sexuality and gender in the Hebrew Bible. One of his books has the title Holy Resilience, the Bible's Traumatic Origins, and explores ways of both the Old and New Testaments, how they were profoundly shaped by the trauma and survival of ancient Israel and the early church. Next to me, Anthony Jermaine Ross Allam, PhD student, social ethics. Jermaine is a third-year doctoral student, started out in 2017. Coursework is successfully behind. Now in the very exciting comprehensive exam period. Okay, you might tell something about that. And last but not least, Vanessa Hutchinson, Vice President of Admissions and Financial Aid. She is really the one who knows exactly how you need to put together your application materials, how you submit everything on time, and last but not least, how the financial aid process works at Union. My name is Jan Raymond. I'm a visiting professor for critical theory and social analysis. I also teach German and French, and I'm the director of the PhD program. Unfortunately, I have to leave the panel about 7:15, so that's not out of boredom. When I leave, I have to catch a flight to London this evening. So the idea is every panelist speaks about 10 minutes, so that after, shortly after 7, the presentations here are finished, so we have a discussion. And we should be finished at about 7:45 or 7:50 or something. At this time, the food will be here, right? And the panelists, except Jermaine, will modestly and humbly withdraw because this is then designed as a student-only dinner. Okay, Andrea?
Thank you.
Could you start?
Thanks. Good evening. Hello, everybody. And I am going to speak to some of the steps that you go through in applying to a PhD program, at any PhD program. And I will begin with the question of your research question. What do I want to get a PhD in, and what do I want to write about? And I think sometimes when students decide that they want to get a PhD, they might have a general sense of their field, but they might struggle to come up with a driving question that they can live with for a very long time. So this is actually a very good time to begin to think about PhD applications for the fall of 2020. And you would have a nice head start for that process. So some of this will not apply if you're submitting an application in December. But one of the things I press with my students is to read. Read. You might want to also track the course papers that you've written in your coursework and track the questions that are pressing questions for you. What has been driving you? Is there a pattern? Are there things that come up more than once in the papers that you've written in your coursework? Maybe hook on to those questions and then try to come up with a reading wish list, a bibliography that you could put together for reading, extra reading you can do in the summer. And the reason I start with this is because often we think that the research question we come up with is so brilliant and profound, it must be unique. And yet there might be a conversation already on the ground, or maybe this is a 2 decades old conversation. There might be some new literature that you're unaware of. And so the reading is important so that you can refine your research question. And as you're finding your hook, what's going to drive you, what you can live with for a very long time, you also want to see who your interlocutors are, what they've said about it, and then show in your applications that you've done some homework and that your research question is already part of an ongoing conversation. And then you want to think about, where do I want to get a PhD? Selecting a program is actually not about selecting a school based on geography or the weather. It's, you may already know, selecting a scholar with whom you want to work or a group of scholars with whom you want to work. So your research question is also going to drive a little bit the selection of the institution that you're thinking about. You want to research, you may want to think about the books that you've read and the authors that grab you. Where are they teaching? What are they writing about? And then who are their colleagues? And go ahead and study the faculty at, for example, a theology program. Who are the faculty in a theology program? What are they all writing about? Read their books, see what's going on, and then is there a match for your interests with theirs? And then you might want to start thinking about the actual application itself and what is often called the personal statement. This is not a story about your first pet. This is a story about, essentially I call it an intellectual autobiography. How did you come to the question that is your driving research question? What is the rationale for your question? This can be a deeply personal story, but it's a personal story that tells us something about your scholarly self, about your thinking, and something that will show to an admissions committee how you are connected to your research question. And it actually is, it tells a more compelling story if you can show how you are connected to your question. So it's a personal statement, but it's a statement about the scholarly question. And then your writing sample, this is a drive-by, very speedy, and there's so much more to say about each of these, but I'll just say your writing sample does not have to be related to your research question. It's often better to pick the writing sample that best represents your best work, even if it doesn't match exactly the research question that you're making a case for. And then you also want to give some thought to selecting recommenders and who are going to be the letter writers for you. Typically, it's really to your advantage to find folks with whom you've studied more than one course, someone who can tell a story about your evolution as a student, someone who can speak to a pattern of your commitment to the scholarly life of the mind. And then I also want to mention who not to ask. You may have a really great relationship with the supervisor of your field site, or someone who could write a really good personal statement for you. But this is not an occasion for a character case, right? This is an occasion for someone to make a case about your scholarly ability. And so you also want to dip into the most current, who can speak to who you are as a scholar now. It might have a few red flags in a PhD application process if you select undergraduate instructors to write letters for you, because then people might wonder, well, didn't they have someone more recently that could speak to their work? Why did they have to go back so far, even if so far was only a couple years ago? I also want to, this is really critical, you want to consider also when to ask for letters of recommendation. And I want to say no less than 6 weeks before a deadline. You also want to provide your recommenders with, really the answer is as soon as possible, and maybe even before the fall semester starts, but certainly give your letter writers lots of time. And you also want to give your letter writer something to work with. So you might send them your statement of purpose, your personal statement, a writing sample if they may not have time to read, but at least can glance at. Graded coursework, if you have coursework that you've submitted to that professor with their comments, it might trigger their memory. And then finally, I will end with reaching out to the doctoral program itself is, I would recommend reaching out and making a personal contact, but I want to stress that this is not, I would say the vast majority of the applications we receive, we do not have personal contact with many of the applicants. So it's not necessary, it's not critical, but sometimes someone on an admissions selection committee can make a stronger case for you if they've said, oh yeah, I've had a phone conversation with that person, and they can add a little bit more than, they can supplement what has been presented on paper. And there are some things you want to think about as you're reaching out to someone. Give them a sense of your research interests, make a case for why you think this program would be a good match for you, but you want to get in and get out. It's a short, brief, to the point. Here's who I am. I'm at Union. I'm in my second year of my MDiv program. I'm looking at programs in theology. I'd love to talk to you about this question, and then just request a telephone appointment. Again, not critical, but can be helpful. And I think I'm under time, so I will end there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now you set the bar so high I'd be under time. I'm going to have to use my timer as well. So I'm just going to follow up on one thing that Dr. White said, and then I'm going to talk about the points that I wanted to talk about. This latter point about reaching out to professors, I just want to disclose to you from an ethical standpoint that the way you contact professors, those that are your professors now or those that you hope to work with, sets the tone of a very long conversation and relationship. And so it would not be uncommon for me to receive an email that is about 5 or 6 paragraphs long with 5 attachments. No one wants that email. So short and sweet. I'm interested in the program. Do you have time? I will make myself available when you have time. And then you can set up the conversation. I want to disclose that because just being on the other side, it can really make or break an application because it sets the tone of a relationship. And so you just to say that. Okay, so there's just a few points that I want to go through. And some of them are not going to be as nice and friendly as maybe other points. But Whenever I approach the topic of PhD programs, I'm going to be talking more general and also starting before putting your application together, way before that. And that is my first point. Whenever anyone comes to me and asks me about pursuing a PhD, the first thing I tell them is that I am under ethical obligation to reveal to you the reality of the academic job market. And that is that there are fewer and fewer positions and fewer that will ever result in tenure, which means intellectual freedom and financial stability. Most people who teach in the academy and who get PhDs now will find themselves in serial adjunct positions, which means 7-10 years of adjuncting or visiting professorship. That means a couple $1,000s a class and no benefits, just so you know. If you are interested in a PhD program, you should hear this. If it doesn't deter you, that is fine. But you should become a reader of the Chronicle of Higher Education, of Inside Higher Education, and of the academic wikis on job postings for every single academic year. Why? Because you should know what you're signing up for and what the work you're going to undergo that may or may not ever result in the position that you aspire for. Okay? And I have to also say that job reality of the market is not just because those people aren't good enough. Some of those people are the best that have been produced, and they're still finding themselves in those positions. So the final thing I'll say about this is that you should ask yourself, well, if I get my PhD, is there a position outside of the academy that I can use that in? So working in a different type of organization or working in a community or doing public theology. Is there someplace else that I can use a PhD? Okay, that's a very big move. You read the Chronicle Education, there's lots of discussion about that. At the same time, as I just said, that you should ask yourself that, you should also ask yourself, for what I want to do I actually need a PhD? Because sometimes we're motivated by the desire to have the credential, but we don't need the credential. So you should really do some discernment. Okay, the second point I want to make is that you should be asking yourself, in line with what I just said, should I pursue a PhD? So not just do I need it, but am I able to do it? And so this isn't about your research interests. This is about reckoning with what PhD work actually entails. And so this is the not great stuff. PhD work's not a placeholder. It's not like other school, even MA or MDiv level schooling. It is of a degree of intensity, commitment, and solitary working that you will have never experienced before. And so in discerning should I pursue a PhD, you need to know what it entails and requires. So for instance, do you love writing? I'm not asking you to answer it, but you should be asking yourself, why? Because most of what a PhD does is research and write. And so if you answer the question, I'm not really a big fan of writing, PhD is not your thing. Your work is elsewhere, and that will be valuable work. But writing is a huge component of it. Do I like to research? Am I independently driven and able to complete projects by myself with little or no supervision? Jan will come and tell you that your 5 years is coming up. But if you fail to produce your project, you fail to produce it. In PhD writing, there's not a lot of excessive hand-holding, at least in my experience, okay? PhD, the last thing I'll say here is that the PhD is not the time to improve your skills. So if you apply and say, I'm developing my writing, no, you develop it before and then you do your PhD because the process is so intensive. And then just the final that's not about intellectual or academic work is I like people to be aware about the impact on yourself and on your family. Go read in the Chronicle of Higher Education, Inside Higher Education, about the levels of depression and anxiety and things of that sort. This is not the pretty picture, but it's an ethical disclosure.
It places strains on family. Why? Because it's intensive work, just like any intensive scenario. None of this is a deterrent. It's just a realistic picture. If you say, oh, Dr. Rhodes said all that, and I heard it, and I understand it's real, and I still want to do it, then fine. That's a good thing. But you should be asking those questions. Okay. The third, let me just check this. I'm not as good at, I didn't even start it, so there you go. There we go. We'll start it on this like 3 minutes or something like that. I'm good. Okay. So if you get past that and you've walked through that process, and this is where there's going to be some differences of opinion on this panel about this, you might get to the stage of researching programs. I am trained in a discipline where I don't want to see an application with a formed research question. I want to know what your interests are, but if you apply and you have your research question fully formed, I'm asking, what are you going to gain from us in 2 years of coursework? My expectation in my disciplines is that you would be developing your question through the process of those 2 years of coursework. And so you need to be very strategic about that. When you try to discern what kind of program you might be interested in, I think it's very good to think about disciplines. Sometimes people come to me and say, well, I'm interested in doing comparative feminist theology and I want to write on that. And so I want to do my PhD in that. And I say, wait a second. What discipline do you want to teach in? Because when you pick a PhD program, it's not just about you being, you writing on the topic that interests you. It's about you being trained in the questions, concerns, and methods of a particular academic field. And if you hope to be a teacher, I'm going to get real with you for a second, you will probably never have the lovely chance to teach on the topic of your dissertation. You will be teaching 101 intro-level class to the discipline. So if you have a topic, I want to do Muslim feminist conversations with Christian womanists, fine. But from what disciplinary perspective? History? Ethics? Theology? Interdisciplinary studies? Because those will be the tools that you need to go out and get a job later. Nobody, when they hire you, they'll listen to you about your research project, but can you teach Intro to World Religions? Can you teach the entirety of the Bible in 2-month course? That's what people are looking for on the job market. So I encourage students to go and look at disciplines. What do they teach? What tools? And ask yourself, if I had to teach one class every year for the rest of my life, what intro class would that be? Because it helps discern your passion, right? Oh, it would be in systematic theology, or it would certainly be in ethics, or it would be in cultural studies. Whatever it is. But the answer to that question in my field should drive your selection of a program. Ideally, there will be the scholars that you love at that program, but you need to go to a program where you will be disciplined into the field. And I don't mean discipline like discipline, I mean taught the discipline. And so just as a final point, in doing that, my advice to you all is, if you're interested in pursuing this, is that you go to the best institution that you can get into in the discipline you want to pursue. Why? It comes back to the training you'll get there, the funding you will get there, but also the likelihood of getting employed. Go online and look up the smallest colleges in the United States, okay? Go to their theology or religion department and look at where those people got their degrees. Because at the smallest universities, in the most remote places in the United States, the people who teach there come from the best institutions. So if you're going to do this, you should make a strong enough pitch, a strong enough application, a strong enough writing sample to get into the best institution that you possibly can. I don't even know how to stop this. I do, technically. I just can't think about it. If that makes sense. You want to package yourself. If you're like, I can get into any institution. Yeah, but what it turns out into in terms of your prospects are something to reckon with. And then I'll leave it there. We can come back to questions. Thank you. Is it going this way? No, this way.
All right. Good evening. It's so great to hear colleagues present these perspectives, and I'll try not to overlap too much because I think I just would build on a lot of what my colleagues have already said. I think, Jerusha in particular did such a great job of ethically presenting words you may have heard in other forums and other points about just the realities of the job market. At the same time, I want to say, at least for me, my decision to go ahead, people were telling me some pretty dire things when I was in a place you all were now, about how it would be very difficult for somebody to get a job. And my first job, which was at a small Methodist seminary in the middle of Ohio, there were 150 other applicants for it. I lucked out. I mean, that worked out great for me. But things have been tough for a while, and they're tougher now. But I'm so happy I made that decision to go out on a limb and pursue this life of teaching and stuff. I think I want to say that it's an incredible thing, and amidst all that sort of thing. So that could be a really exciting thing to be considering. So what I want to do with most of my time here is to just imagine myself in your seat and what I would want someone to tell me who had been in the midst of PhD applications and could sort of coach me on what people are looking for and how to form an application. And this is very specifically focused on any kind of graduate program, not just Union at all. I guess the first and most general thing I would want to say is that more than at any other point in your education, the school to which you're applying needs to see you as not only just academically competent, but having a level of excellence in your work that would give you the chance to be one of the top 10 graduates in your field in the entire country. That's just a number pulled out of the air, but just to give you a sense, you have to show prospects. They have to see in your file the sparkle and the ability that says this person could be at the top of their discipline. That's what people are looking for. And the other thing people are looking for, frankly, because a lot of programs, even at fairly large universities now, don't have set slots in different disciplines. So, say at Union, just to take an example, as Jan Raymond mentioned, we've got 4 or 5 slots, and we've got more than that number of disciplines. So when we get to the admissions process, we're all reading files from other fields, and we're arguing for a certain set of candidates with colleagues who are in other areas and trying to decide who are we going to give an offer to. And there is a risk, this is what I'm wanting to say, and this is true anywhere in the country, there's a risk that I could go to the mat fighting for a candidate that I think has lots of sparkle, and then they end up going somewhere else, and that's it in terms of my hopes of having a PhD student that year. So one thing that people are trying to assess is ability, but frankly also they're trying to assess how likely is it that this person will come to my institution if we come up with an acceptance offer and a fellowship. And that leads me to another version of the point I think that's been made by my colleagues is it's hard to go to the mat for and fight for a candidate, however gifted they seem, if they've never in any way contacted you in the program. I mean, it's just difficult. And so some people don't get the mentoring they need to know they need to do that. It needs to be done appropriately. But I think if you're interested in studying with someone, and be serious, because by this point in my career, I can smell it when somebody's trying to BS me, just trying to have an option. People who show they actually know some of what you're passionate about or interested in it, they can make a compelling case that they're interested in it too. That sort of connection makes a difference because you're going to be working together with that person for a few years. And so it's important for them to have a sense that it'll work and for you to have a sense it'll work. Let me cover a few other things quickly. To be in play in application process when people are going through the massive files and they only have a few spots. Grades. It's not crucial that you have, in terms of union system, CDs in everything you take. It just isn't, and not in my view. It is important, though, that you have CDs or get to CDs in the field that you end up applying in. So sometimes I think students play it too conservatively in choosing their courses while they're at Union because they're scared they might not get a CD outside their field taking this or that professor outside their field. That's a mistake. That's limiting. On the other hand, you really need to focus on where you're going to be. Another thing, frankly, it's not great, but it's true, is GREs. We know there are all sorts of socioeconomic biases connected to these sorts of standardized tests. At the same time, in the PhD program business, there are a number of programs that have enough applications that there's just a cutoff. And if you're not above a certain GRE level, at least for your verbals, you're not in play. So to become a top candidate in a program, another crucial thing is making sure that the faculty in your area, if you're studying at Union, here at Union, are your advocates. And if you're looking at a program, making sure that some faculty member at that program is your advocate. And I've already covered the issue of having contact. Recommendations. This is one of the key areas because grades are such apples and oranges between different institutions. You never know really what an A at one institution means compared to a B plus at another or whatever. But I do read letters of recommendation carefully. And the fact is, you know, every one of us, when we write letters for you all or our colleagues at other institutions write letters for us, they know they need to be credible. They can't pass off a student who's average as excellent and hope that we'll take the letter seriously the next year. So this is a business where we just have to be really honest with each other. So you have to help give your professors here a chance to really see what you can do, be able to write with passion and credibility about your excellence and that kind of thing. And then we'll be honest about it to our colleagues. Writing sample has to be not just competent, but excellent. And this means for Bible that I look for a combination of use of some biblical languages and sparkle and originality. I want to see that this person's not just going to be okay, but it's going to be fantastic in the field somehow. That's something I keep looking for. And one other thing, frankly, too, though, is because we're reading across disciplines, you need to not submit a writing sample that's so specialized in an area that people in other areas won't be able to see that sparkle too. So it's a tricky balance to strike, you know, having something that both shows your excellence to folks in your field, but also demos the kind of potential you have for folks who are going to be reading outside the discipline. And then finally, for your statement, your statement, you know, of what you're up to. I, with Jerusha Rhodes, would say in Bible and historical fields, the concept of a research question is not a helpful one going into the application process because the students' research questions will be so shaped by their coursework. I have had students come to me with a very specific topic or question, and it is a bit of a problem for me because then I wonder what they're planning to learn in Bible. And I worry there'll be a process of negotiation. So this is just another example of the place where you need to learn about the program you're applying to, about the field you're applying to, and the kinds of things you really need to put together for that program and field, because they're different. And that's one of the virtues of having different ones of us talk about this subject with each other. But overall, I think it can be an absolutely amazing process to be in. And the key thing really, as Professor Rhodes was saying, is having a vision of some different kinds of ways, if you decide to go forward with the PhD, different sorts of ways that might work out well for you, just because the odds of getting a tenure track position that many of us aimed for at the beginning are slim. And so you have to have a plan B and often a plan C of where you'd be fully fulfilled having invested yourself this way in the academic enterprise. And I'll turn things over at that point.
Good evening, everybody. I will start out, I guess, by giving you an idea about how I decided to get a PhD program, and then I'll say a little bit about what it was like to begin taking the formal steps to decide what discipline, what place, and all of that. So hopefully my comments now will serve as an introduction to what maybe we'll talk about later. Hopefully I'll give you some ideas of some questions that you'll ask once the cameras are off and we can just talk about things. The first thing I'd like to say is that I can't overemphasize the value of talking to people about what you're planning to do, even if you don't know what you want to do in a doctoral program. I was not raised in a family of academics, and so I had absolutely no one within my family circle who could tell me, this is what you do in a master's program in order to position yourself to get into a PhD program. But I was very fortunate to have a lot of people around me directly before I applied to a PhD program who were either in PhD programs themselves, or they were up for tenure that year, or in some phase of the academic process. And so they understood the culture of academic institutions, and they could tell me some of the nuts and bolts of things that I would never have known. For example, you'll look at the requirements for applying for a PhD program, and the questions look straightforward, the paperwork looks normal. And if you approach it in a so-called normal way, you might run the risk of missing the entire point and not knowing how your answers will be judged. And so I say all of that just to emphasize that if you're interested in applying for a PhD program, talk to people who are in PhD programs, talk to your professors, ask the questions that you think might be stupid or embarrassing questions, because the chances that they're probably not stupid and embarrassing questions, but that they're strategic and wise questions to ask. And all of the PhD students that are currently on campus that I know of love to answer those types of questions. And I'm also someone who can tell you what I did, what I wish I had done, and what people told me as opposed to what I thought I knew. So feel free to just nab some of us on the side and say, hey, I have questions, because that's part of our responsibility to all of us here in this community. I began thinking about doing a PhD the first semester that I was in seminary. And I started going to seminary because I was playing piano at a church and ended up getting involved in some of the religious activities and asked so many questions that someone said, you know, you should maybe go to a seminary and ask them these questions. And as luck would have it, the first course that I took allowed me to read a book by Gary Dorian, who is my current advisor. And I had no idea that that was going to happen. But I'm saying all of this because I went into seminary with a set of questions. Most of those questions I still have to this day. But people encourage me, follow those questions, ask those questions, don't give up until you find their answers or find better questions. And eventually my professors, after hearing my questions and reading my work, asked me this strange question: do you want to be an academic or do you want to be a pastor? And I didn't really at that moment understand why I needed to make that distinction right away. I tell you that also because in light of what you've heard about vocational choices and the job market, it does make sense to think broadly about, do I just want to do one thing? Do I have the capacity to do a couple of different things in different proportions? Those types of questions are smart questions to ask, especially while you're getting an MDiv or an MA or trying to make a distinction between which of those things. Whether or not you will complete an ordination process, all of that is part of how you think about ways to make your life work and ways to fulfill your vocation in light of all of the bread and butter issues that are associated with one track or another. When I finally got my head together and decided what I was going to do, I decided that what would work best for me would be to finish my MDiv, get ordained, and I did get ordained with the PCUSA, and then to approach my ministry with at least two different goals. One, to do ministry well. Two, to do ministry in such a way that I will clarify for myself what my research questions really are, based particularly on the contexts in which I was working. And I worked as an associate pastor simultaneously in two different church institutions. One that was very urban, red, black, and one that was very suburban, majority white. And both of those congregations thought social justice was important and racial justice was important. And dealing with all of those topics in those different ways actually helped me understand what the difference is between what are my real driving questions versus what are kind of social justice trends that are in the air. And finding the place where I thought my interests matched with what was possible to discover or research in a field was a very important process to understand what do I want to study. I also began my tenure as a pastor letting everybody that I knew, including my supervisors, that I want to do this for 4 or 5 years, and then I will apply for PhD programs. If you know anyone who can help me with these questions, let me know. If you have any advice, etc., let me know. I say that to you so that you realize that your discernment process should involve more than just yourself. There are people around you who come from either your families, your church communities, or activist communities who can let you know, hey, I see this in you. Why don't you try this? Or when you raise these questions, I find it interesting. Or do you know so-and-so? Or email this person. I was in a process like that when I was taking some seminar. I don't remember what the seminar was. But one of the seminar attendees happened to be a former student of my current advisor. And during an introduction of all of the participants in the seminar, people said, let's go around the circle and just ask people why they're taking this seminar. It was on Martin Luther. And when I explained that I'm taking this seminar in part to continue thinking about how to refine my research question, and then I said what some of my research questions were, the result was that afterwards I was taken aside and someone said, hey, like, have you ever thought of Gary Dorian at Union Theological Seminary? After that, I went online to see, okay, like, what has Gary Dorian written and how does it match with my research interests? And realized that the very first book that I read in seminary that I cared about was a book written by Gary Dorian, and it was called The Neoconservative Mind, which addressed a lot of questions that I cared about on the intersection between social ethics and political theology. And after a series of other conversations and researching other institutions, I realized I need somebody or a group of people to talk to help me figure out how to make the best possible application. And what I thought was a very straightforward process ended up being a stressful process, full of so many details that I felt like giving up several steps along the way just because of the number of applications you'd consider doing and all of the other work you might be doing during the same time period. So one of the things that I realized is that I was really fortunate to be around several academics who would tell me honestly, oh, your proposal sounds like it doesn't make any sense, like try it again. Or what you think sounds like a research focus is so broad it's not focused at all. Or when you write a statement of purpose, it should sound like this. It should give people the idea of this. It should include some of this. And you put too much of this one thing, you put too little of this other thing, you're not giving an impression of yourself that would distinguish you from other applicants. And it's fortunate if you have people around there who are nitpicky and don't mind giving you critical advice, because that's what helps you refine what it is you think you want to do, and also think strategically about whether or not you're getting yourself across in a way that will advantage you in the application process. And so during the question and answer time period and whenever our pizza comes, I guess if you have any other questions to ask, I'll be happy to continue that conversation, and I look forward to hearing from you all.
Thank you.
So thanks. I'm here to give the perspective of the admissions office, and one of the particularities of doctoral admissions is that it's a faculty-driven process. But the conduit is through the Office of Admissions. And so not only will I'll speak to some general things to think about with doctoral admissions, because there is some commonality between what your experience might be at Union and other programs, and I'll also talk about Union-specific requirements with admissions. And so the admissions office, typically in the doctoral admissions process, unlike either undergraduate or even other master's levels admissions, plays very little role in the decision-making process. It's entirely faculty-driven. Our job is to make sure that there's adequate communication for students, to connect students to faculty, depending on what the practice is at that university. So at Union, faculty are generally open to be contacted, but that may be different at different institutions. And typically, the admissions office might be one of the places to go to find out how do you do that.
and then to clarify what is the process to apply, and work with applicants on making sure they have a submitted application. So you should be aware that's how you're, a lot of times we'll get questions in admissions about, well, what are you looking for, or what are my chances? And typically, you know, an admissions officer can't answer that question for doctoral admissions. And you should know that, for example, with some of our peer institutions, the doctoral program may not even be within their divinity school. For example, there are many universities where the doctoral program is actually in the School of Arts and Sciences at their university, and they're completely within the divinity program. They're not even receiving the applications for those students. There's still the faculty are engaged, but it may be a completely different setup than what you would see at Union or at a school where the doctoral program lives within their divinity school. So you need to do your research on all of those things to understand the process completely. And then the other point I would make from an admissions perspective is that you definitely need to understand that it's the competition in terms of the doctoral admissions process that has been discussed with the faculty impacts how admissions looks at your application. And from an admissions perspective, what that means is of any program that a school will offer, we are most strict with deadlines when it comes to doctoral admissions. In most cases, we may have a grace, you know, sometimes if students have late materials. With master's programs, you may have some leeway to allow for late applicants and accommodate issues if you're missing a particular part of your application. But typically, we're so competitive for, and it's been my experience in admissions, doctoral admissions is so competitive, there's very little window to, for example, not submit you know, a GRE test score and have a process that can wait even a week or a few weeks for that material to come in. You may have already missed the time frame and the window to have your application reviewed. So as a doctoral applicant, it's critical to make sure that your materials come in by the deadline. We leave those decisions to faculty, for example. So if I talk to, this is at several institutions, so not just Union, it's a faculty decision as to whether or not they will accept any late applications. And in most cases, if the faculty is not already aware, or faculty are not already aware of the applicant and asking for their materials, the answer is going to be no, because we will typically find enough applications at the deadline to have plenty of applications to review for the size of the program. So making sure you communicate with recommenders to make sure they submit their recommendations on time, that you submit your materials on time is critical, because we cannot hold your application or hold the evaluation process for that missing material. So that is one of the broad pieces of advice that I wanted to share. I'll go through just Union's application requirements. We're actually not that different than other programs, and so I think this will be applicable to many institutions, but you should check with all of the institutions you choose to apply to. The faculty already talked about the personal statement, having a statement of study focus, writing sample or a scholarly paper that's typical in what you would see in an application for admissions to a doctoral program. Most programs also ask you to submit a resume, but more properly a curriculum vitae, which is much more expansive than a resume, and that might also address any teaching you've done or writing or publication credits that you may have. At Union, we ask for 3 letters of reference, and you've heard the feedback from the faculty that there's a strong preference towards academic letters of reference, and it's important to check with your program to find out for the specific program that you're applying to, what are they looking for? Because I think, you know, you just want to make sure that you understand the program that you're applying to, and also understand what constitutes a quorum for a complete application. And so in some cases, some schools may say you can miss one recommendation letter and we'll still review your application. And for other schools, it may be that you have to have all 3. And if you don't have all 3, you are not admissible. And so that means that you have to be in contact with your recommender and with the faculty that are recommending you to give them enough time to submit the recommendation on time. And the onus is on you to follow up with the faculty member to make sure that they understand the process of submitting it, that they have plenty of time to do that, they know what the deadline is,
it's not on the recommender. They rely on you to provide those gentle nudges to make sure the material is in. You will want to make sure that you are submitting enough all of the transcripts that are required for your application to be thoroughly reviewed. So, for example, if you do have coursework at multiple institutions and the grades are not posted on your final transcript, that may mean that you need to request several transcripts, and you want to make sure that's all in, because if we're missing transcripts in an admissions office, it's certain that we cannot forward that application to the committee for evaluation. That's one of the most critical portions, and so we have to have a complete set of transcripts. And typically, I mean, there's really nothing that's not necessary and required, but transcripts is a full stop if we don't have, you know, all of your transcripts to go forward. We also ask for test scores, GRE, and also if for students where they attended institutions where English was not the language of study, that might also include a TOEFL or IELTS score as well. And you will just want to make sure you plan for timing to take those exams, because they're required in various cases. And so, you know, again, timing is important. Most schools allow students to upload unofficial copies of GRE score reports and unofficial copies of transcripts. That's not for every institution. At Union, we allow that, and that's increasingly, I would say, the norm at most schools, so that you don't necessarily have to have the official version and wait for that to come in through the mail. But if you do supply an unofficial transcript, it has to be clear that it's a valid transcript and that it can be tied to you. So for a transcript, for example, typically a PDF version that you might have received from your school registrar, or a copy or a scan of your official transcript, is what might be preferable, that has your name on it, that has this institution's name on it, that has your degree program on it, your graduation date on it. All of those things being missing might call the credential into question and might force the admissions office to write to you for additional information and to have that corrected, and that will delay your application. So you'll want to make sure that any external test score or credential that you submit is complete and can be read. It's not a JPEG file that's with, you know, 7-point font that is illegible, which sometimes happens if you're scanning and you're not checking what the file looks like. You might send something that cannot be read by the committee, and that can't be sent to the faculty. The other thing I'll say around transcripts and other materials for Union students in particular, and this applies to any student who might be applying to their alma mater, is that if admissions offices don't automatically get transcripts from registrar's office. So because of privacy guidelines, all students have to request their transcripts. So even if you're applying to a doctoral program where you are a current master's student, you still need to do the work as if you're an external applicant. We don't treat you any differently in the process. Current students and students that are not our students are on the same footing in the admissions process. So for Union students, for example, or alumni, that means that you have to request your transcript from the registrar to be included in your application. And you can include it yourself. Because we're small, the registrar will walk it across the hall sometimes once you've been admitted. But what they can't do is just give it to us because you decided to apply. That is a violation of federal policy around privacy, and it's actually a common error or a common assumption for a student to think, oh, we're all in the same university and you must have access to my transcript. That isn't the way the process is. The process is set up to keep walls between departments in that way. And so to understand that, you also need to think about planning for that timing in your application, even if you're applying, you know, you're a Union student applying to Union, or if you're applying to another school where you were a student at that time and they have your official transcript that you'd want to include. So that's an important thing to remember, because that can delay your application unintentionally. And then maybe as just a last point, I'll just talk about deadlines. Deadline for Union is December 1st, and we notify in early February, and we ask for a decision from our applicants in terms of where they would like to enroll on April 15th. And this is pretty typical for the doctoral process for most schools. Most schools will have either December or December 15th as a typical deadline.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. So we've been talking a lot now, more than an hour. It's now your turn. So in order to avoid the situation that you ask one question and we get 5 answers, we group several questions before we get it back to the panel. So, but this requires that you ask questions now.
Hi, I was wondering if anyone could speak to the realities of function of being an academic, at least in your experience in this context of teaching, research and writing, publishing, presenting at conferences, running institutes, or all those kinds of things, how you juggle it, what is your cyclical nature of the work, things that might be useful for us to think about as well.
Does Union have any statistics about students, like even in the last, 5 or 10 years, in terms of what percentage complete in 4 years versus 5 years, 7 years, and any statistics around what PhD students do when they graduate?
I have a question from someone on Instagram who says, what is the most important theme or ideas to get across in a personal statement, and how do you caption that?
What are careers beyond academia that make use of the research skills and the teaching skills that you might be developing in a PhD program?
Something about one question. I'd like to say something about one question, about the statistics question. First of all, we don't have so far reliable statistics about what how PhD students are placed after they graduate. We need to work on that, but we are not yet there. So sorry, but that's how it is. The other question, statistics of how many students are able to do that within 5 years. Also, we are not yet there, and the reason is this rule that you can apply for the summer funding and the 5th year, this is pretty new. This is from 2018. So it needs some time until we can see how that plays out in terms of shortening the doctoral program. And so if you ask me after May 2020, I could tell you a little bit more, because then I see how many of the students were able to graduate within these 5 years. But now I don't know yet. So, but my expectation is maybe I'm carefully optimistic. I see the tendency that several students will most probably do it within the 5 years. So that's my positive expectation. So, the other questions?
I had some ideas on a couple of them, but before I did, I wanted to ask Kimberly, could you just expand just a little bit on what kind of thing you're particularly curious about with the realities of academic life?
I think I'm wondering how one manages the energy of all the functions and juggling all the different spaces. Whether it's how one approaches their year or sets their goals and moves forward things, and understanding there's a skill set for working with publishers, and where does that kind of thing come from, or how do you decide what conferences to present at, or when you need to apply for funding or fellowships and all those kinds of things. How does it all work together? Because we see you guys for a day a week, but we know there's lots of other things you do outside of that.
Okay, thank you. That's a great question. I actually see you on an ongoing basis elsewhere, so maybe we can pursue that conversation another time. I'm going to address two of the other questions really briefly. One was a question from over here about other careers that sometimes people think about in relation to doctoral work. And all of these, there's a big question mark that could be raised about them in terms of Jerusha Rhodes's point about you don't necessarily need the PhD credential to do them, but these are the types of things people sometimes do after they have a PhD so that they can sort of pursue stuff that, like adjunct teaching or other kinds of stuff in addition to the work. One of them, frankly, if you're getting a degree in Bible or history or theology, is some people already have an MDiv, have an inclination toward pastoral ministry of some kind or church ministry, and they get a church ministry job. And then they'll teach on the side. And they'll teach in their church, too, building on their work. There are an increasing number of people coming out of PhD programs who end up getting jobs teaching in private schools, in high schools and junior highs. You don't necessarily need a doctorate to do that. Some of the better private schools are very happy to have people with doctorates. And frankly, you're often better paid, have better job security, and have smarter students than academically able students than the students who you're teaching in an adjunct setting in a college somewhere. There are benefits to that too, but I just think that's another one. College chaplain, those jobs aren't as plentiful as they once were, but that's often a way people also can put a part of their academic ideas together with work. And academic administration is another thing where having a doctorate qualifies you for certain kinds of work sometimes. So those are that's just an initial listing of Plan B types of things and to think about. In terms of the personal statement, the most important thing to think about in a personal statement, it's one thing to really be clear on, I think, is first of all that it's a different genre than the personal statement was getting into seminary. For a PhD program, we're not so interested in your conversion narrative, how you're going to change the world. Though that's more true at Union, but it really is making a compelling case for your intellectual connection to the place you're going, and one that's real. So it both says something about you. It builds a story about you that makes sense and sticks in people's minds. It's like this. I could see. For example, I'm looking at Christian in the back row who was applying last year, and so he was talking about his interest in reconciliation as somebody who had spent the first years of his life growing up in South Africa and then coming to the U.S., and how that set of questions was interesting to him as he looked at biblical traditions. And he could make a case also really about how that connected to stuff that Professor Hamori and I do here at Union. So we could sort of say, yeah, that's somebody we could see work. So it's that connection, that narrative connection in the personal statement that makes all the difference, I think.
So just a few comments on the what can you do outside of other possible outside of the academy PhD jobs. It really depends on the field. Understand that you're again being disciplined into a field, so there are research skills and writing skills which will be portable to many disciplines and many jobs, but it depends on what you focused in. And so I know plenty of people who go into policy, they go into conflict resolution, but also a number of people in my cohort. When I was at graduate school at Georgetown, one of my cohort members now runs all the religion exhibits at the Natural History Museum in D.C. So he's in charge of that. He's a curator for that. And so there are creative opportunities, but some of the resources that I pointed to before, like Chronicle of Higher Education, they have lots of articles on this. And by the way, to the point made, the wonderful points made before, they also have wonderful articles on how to do the process. And one of my big ethical commitments and pedagogical commitments is this rendering things visible that are known by some but not known by all of us. And so myself, I didn't I came from I come from a family where half the people went to college and half the people barely finished high school, right? So I don't have any of that repertoire of knowledge, and so that has become one of my personal commitments. So some of those websites are really great places. There's also a website, this is going to be a shout out to the person, called The Doctor is In, and it's written by someone who was a full professor and then left the academy to pursue other things, such as writing books on how to be in the academy, which is one thing you could do with a PhD if you don't stay in the academy. But that website has everything on how to walk through the application process, to some of the Kimberly's questions about what it's like to be an academic, to how to go through tenure, to how to balance your workload, and also really important stuff on the way that being in the academy is not the same for all of us. The way that it is gendered, the way that it is race, the way that it is Christian dominant, and all of these kind of things that really impact what you're asked to do, what kind of advising you have to do, what kind of writing you have to do. So all that aside, the other thing I just want to add too is that for me, in a personal statement, what I look for is, I said before, not that you have a rigid and formal statement and this is what I'm going to do, but that you have these interests, you have these haunting questions that you're really trying to grapple with, and that when you are doing that, you demonstrate two things in particular. One, that you know what other people have written on that topic. I'm going to say something that is going to sound way too direct, but you all need to hear it. I don't want to tell you how many applications for PhDs we get where people are talking about certain people's work, and that is not their actual work, or they've never written in that field. Don't make that mistake, because that's just right out of the door. So if you're interested in a field or a question, read the people who have written. And when you write your application, I look not to see, like your literature review, but to see, I read this book and it was interesting. It made me think about that. And then I was thinking there. And then the other thing that I think is really important to demonstrate is your open intellectual agility. So you know some stuff, and you bring some stuff, and you want more stuff, and you're kind of nimble in your approach to it. And how you do that can be done a million different ways. But, when you look at an application, it has sparkle, but it also has like a thirst. I need to know more. Yeah, curious. Yeah, but it's like more than curious, right? It's open curiosity.
Yeah, so I'll just add a couple more points very, very quickly. I will tell a brief story about being on a panel, not unlike this, where three of us were giving papers. One of us was giving a paper. She was bare-breasted in nursing while she was giving her academic paper, and after we gave our papers during the Q&A, someone asked her, how do you manage work-life balance? And her response was, it's a lie. There is no balance. And so I tell this story because when I think about the things that consume the academic, any single thing could be all-consuming. The amount of time that it takes to prepare for a class could be absolutely every second that you have, every spare second that you have to do it. You can absolutely use all the time you're given. That is the same for your service. That is the same for your writing. So everything is all-consuming, and the demands for excellence in every single aspect. So it's demanding, and it's good to know that there might not be any balance. I wish I could tell a different story, but nevertheless. And then back to this, what's the most important thing in the statement of purpose question? I mean, it's really repeating what's already been said in this search for the sparkle in the application. I look for something distinctive. What's distinctive about this person? And I'm also trying to imagine whether or not this student will be a contributor to the field. Is there something that's going on in the application that is an indicator of potential for something unique? So something distinctive and unique, but also that can be a contribution, a meaningful contribution. I'm not talking about, the student has to write a dissertation. A dissertation often needs to meet the bar of making an original contribution to the field. That's not what I'm looking for in an application, but something that shows some promise, something distinctive that is an indicator. So I'll stop there.
I guess I'm the new Jan Raymond since he had to go and take a flight. But do you have any other folks want to give us maybe 3 or 4 questions, and we'll group them again together?
Hi. I have one question. So how do you maintain your academic integrity but still holding in your mind the context in which, like we will say, the people you're writing for in your writing, and not writing for academic per se, but still grounding it into where you can still reach the people, into communities that can understand your work, and can take it for what it is, and not have to look into dictionaries all the time to figure out what they're trying to say, if you guys can speak to that.
I'm on the other side, but I'll still ask a question. I wanted to know if you could speak to considerations students should make relative to the community they are moving to, not just in terms of the academic community, but also physically where the institution is, what cultural values there are there, whether or not they can afford to eat, and those types of broader cultural understandings of where they're moving to, not just academically, but in terms of how they'll live and sustain themselves outside the institution.
No balance. And you might start.
Okay, so, you all have such fabulous and important questions, right? And so I want to say something about both these questions. I'm going to start with the latter one about where you're moving to. I believe it was Dr. White who said that you can't really make this decision based upon geography. And it's true. The pragmatic reality is it's a complex puzzle, and you need to assess multiple factors. So you really should go to a program that's going to fund you and fund you well, and a program that's going to provide you institutional support, such as teaching fellowships and summer support. And Union, we're getting ourselves together and doing our best, but it is a big consideration, as is who are the scholars there, and as is what are the opportunities for money to go to conferences so I can network with other people so that when I go out on the job market, as is geography, as is family. All of these count. And I really believe you can't check both of these questions to me are about checking yourself at the door, and you can't check that reality at the door. And so as someone who walks through life needing to be concerned about where I am and who is around me often, what I would say is you can't make the decision solely on geography or the context, but it will be one of many factors. And so when you make your list of potential institutions, some of them will be geographically and contextually and culturally the best fit, and some of them will be tolerable, and some of them will be absolute no's. But that will only be one factor among many. So I would never advocate for someone to go someplace where they feel unsafe or that they could be harmed. And there are some places where that could happen to some people, right? But at the same time, geography can't be the only consideration. And then to this question about writing, two things. One is a little crass, and that's to say that if you get into the academy, you're going to have multiple communities. And one of those communities is going to be the other academics. And so they will be your people. And that means that when you're pursuing tenure and writing up into the tenured process, you have to write for them. Now, that does not preclude you writing for your other communities, but what you should do, and my best suggestion, is look at models of people who have done that well, who have, in that time before they get tenure, found a modality of writing both to their academic community and in conversation there, but in a more accessible way and in a way that's concerned with the realities on the ground. I know for myself that that's something very important but I would characterize it more in my work, that those have been my core commitments, but I've also been lucky institutionally. So for instance, teaching at Union provides me a degree of freedom that most academics will never have. Most academics and teaching, you will never be able to talk about the should or the could be in communities. You will be in the descriptive bubble, and the second you step into constructive land or saying, I think this should be how it is, that is off limits. So you should think about both where you train, and that should be another criteria. Where you train, do they cultivate the dual discourses to the on the ground and to the academy or not? And then it's a little bit luck, right? I know a lot of people who sit intensive. I have a friend who writes about Islamic feminism as well, but is at a state institution in a great position and is perpetually battling why are you writing like you're a member of this community? And she's saying, but I am a member of this community, and they're saying it's not academic. So it's just something to be aware of, but look for models of people who have done it well. If that makes sense. And then there's also the tenure reality. Sorry, that's a really long-winded. So you might write both books at the same time, or save them up for later.
I think this is a really interesting question you've raised. And it was one that I struggled with a lot before I went into PhD program. It took me a lot to give myself permission to go the academic route because the people I looked up to were more in the more direct activist model, and I don't present myself as some great pillar of an example of how to do this, but I had to make a decision, really, sort of along the lines of what Jerusha Rhodes said, that I was going to spend a good while really doing the academic thing, and writing for that academic community and getting cred in that group. You don't go anywhere, at least if you're in the higher ed track, unless you do that. And so I did do that for a long time. And then I got to a point where I had tenure and I had a position where I could do more writing for other communities of accountability that I cared about. I had done some of that along the way. My first published article was a version of my inaugural lecture at the seminary I got my first job at, and it was very much oriented toward activist interpretation. But most of it, my work, was very much written for this tiny little group of people. That said, I wanted to raise one other thing that I think can be overlooked in this discussion. We can get a little too focused on writing as the only form of productive publishing. And I guess, so you get your degree, or even before your degree, you're teaching in various contexts as a teaching assistant or fellow, or as an adjunct, or getting your first job, maybe as a postdoc or whatever. And then you're in a room like this, and you're looking out at a group of folks like you, and you're trying to give them the best you have to offer and to ignite them about your field. And insofar as you succeed, that's going to have an impact way beyond how many people read your monograph. That was your dissertation in many ways. It's amazing, the impact. And so I think sometimes the whole academic game can skew things a little too much toward only recognizing the kind of publishing that happens in terms of writing, important as that is, and not recognize these other forms of publishing that happen in the mode of teaching in classes or making public presentations, or that sort of impact. That's a really important form of productivity.
Yeah, I will also address this question of audience, reaching the community, and I think you started with the notion of preserving integrity in the work that you do. And I want to preface my remarks by saying I resist the division between theory and practice, head and heart, that perpetuates this notion of, I think it's a false dichotomy. And I think that our practices are better practices when they are thinking practices. I also, I think that I spend a lot of time doing adult education, religious education in churches. And the work that I do in the classroom, the work that I do in a conference paper, the work that I do in a church could all be about the same thing, but as soon as you change the audience, the task becomes different. When I teach a womanist theology class or a James Cone class, which I've done very, very, very recently, I'm actually doing it right now at Riverside, it actually becomes more difficult for me to do the work, the translation work that's necessary for folks who haven't read the entire corpus of James Cone, right? I mean, you were at the James Cone conference, so you know what I'm talking about. So there's a way to address different audiences without losing integrity, but knowing your audience. And I will just repeat what's already being stated. I like talking to other academics. I like that being one of my audiences. I have integrity when my writing is speaking to them. And it also happens to be a stepping stone for recognition in the academy to get tenure and promotion and et cetera, et cetera. So your interlocutors can be different, your audience can be different, but it can all be of a piece as well. Yeah, I don't know if that answers your question. Jorge, we'll talk later.
I wanted to also address Nordia's question, and I also echo what's been said already, but I would add to it that I think part of the process of academic training is a creative process where you always have to wrestle with the question, like, what's my relationship to an audience or the people who are sponsoring me or the people who love and support me or my community. But it's also a great opportunity to explore, like, what is my relationship to a community and how can it be more flexible, and like what opportunity does a certain location give me to be more creative than I would have been able to be in another circumstance. For example, like, I know folks who are in this very seminary who for the first time in life get to ask a question like, oh, like, I don't know, what kind of Christian am I? What kind of Buddhist am I? What kind of Muslim am I? What does it mean to explore various ways to be an academic, studying things, but then also engaging with people? And so I think on one hand, no one wants to lose touch with who they are and where they come from, but the opportunity also exists to be authentic, not by repeating a certain expected relation, but then to see what's more appropriate than what's appropriate or what's possible, maybe what's missing in my community that I might have a privileged opportunity to explore. And I think sometimes, like, it took me a couple of months being here at Union before I realized, like, oh, not only am I here to do like what I came here to do, but there's also new possibilities that I can explore that wouldn't have been possible had I gone to some other school or done some other work. So I think the chance to just think creatively about what is now possible, about how I relate to my community, is also something that is inspiring to people who have to make different choices with work and with time.
And I actually wanted to revisit Jorge's question because he talked a little bit about how to choose where to go, what kind of environment you wanted to be in, and then also how to make it work. And I think that it's actually very important to think about that, going maybe very direct and thinking nuts and bolts, because you mentioned just thinking about how to eat. And I think that that goes back to funding for the doctoral program. So many programs are fully funded. I don't know of any programs that can guarantee that you have funding until you complete your degree. So some will push 5 and 6 years, but it's possible for students to move beyond that. And then I would also just say, as a financial aid administrator and someone who works in enrollment, that most packages are intended or drafted for students that are single. So you are not awarded additional funding if you have a family, if you have not only a partner but dependents. And I think that it's very important for you to think about in your decision, is the funding sufficient for what you need to do? Because if you do have a family, and you have a spouse, maybe they're working and that might take some of the financial pressure off, but some students may have to work because of their financial situation. Also, if you have multiple degrees, so many students pursue another master's degree before even coming for their divinity degree. It's not uncommon to have a degree in journalism, in law, or some other field, even before your divinity degree. And then if you haven't had the opportunity to address that debt before pursuing a PhD, it can have an impact on your ability to complete your doctoral degree. So most students the funding is sufficient enough within the funded years of study that as long as you don't have serious extenuating circumstances or if you have a spouse that can't work, for example, to help contribute funding if you're in that situation, it's sufficient. So most students don't actually need additional, at the Union, for example, most doctoral students in their first 4 years of funding don't need to seek additional funding like student loans. So we don't have many doctoral students that are seeking student loans, but they may be looking for funding in other areas. So trying to get other grants, external grants, programs that they may be eligible for to add to their funding, taking on teaching as a way to get additional funding. And so it is important to actually sit down and do the math.
No to additional teaching while you're in kindergarten.
Well, I mean, but
it's a reality, and it's also the fast track to then finishing.
Well, and I think those are things that you need to think about. And so you should, I think, we talked about the fact that many people come to the process wanting that credential. And then Jerusha said, do you need that credential? And then you need to ask the further question, can I afford to do this? Because you are pulling yourself out of the workforce in a particular way for a sustained period of time, and you want to make sure that the program that you go to and your own situation allows you to make it through, because it is important. Students, we want you to succeed, and part of that is making sure that you're in a financially good situation so that you can focus on your studies.
Could I add just one thing to that? Because I've noticed with some doctoral students over the years, the part of the doctoral program that's the most analogous to what they've done before is the coursework, usually 2 or 3 years of coursework. And that's something they've done a lot, and they're interested in the doctoral program because they got a lot out of it and they were good at it. And sometimes thinking through this financial stuff, they kind of plot everything out so that they're going to be good up through when they're done with courses. With the idea somehow, then they're going to pick up some sort of job on the side while they're doing their comps and or their dissertation that's going to take them the rest of the way. And I just want to say that often doesn't work very well. If you're just if you just have worked out your financial plan to get you through the 2 years of coursework or maybe 3 years to your test, that means you're then hitting up against the struggles to make a living and do your academic work at the precise point in your doctoral program when you most need to clear space to just grind out that dissertation and that sort of thing, when you don't have the structure of a course and a deadline and that sort of thing to keep you on track. And so many students, as Jerusha was just hinting at earlier, lose their way at that point, take on various jobs, often adjuncts here or there, or a postdoc or that sort of thing, and then they just can't do that toughest part of the doctoral program. And so insofar as you are thinking about these very real kinds of questions that Jorge was sort of bringing into the mix, trying to plot out a way you have that space across the whole stretch of a doctoral program, 4 or 5 years, can be really important.
It's kind of expanding the nuts and bolts question, but just some other things that you should be looking for when you're looking at programs. And if you're considering applying for a PhD, there are some students who are, there's just one program that is the only program that is going to get them what they want. But for the majority of PhD students, you should be applying to multiple programs because the competitiveness is at such a high standard. There are some niche programs, and Union is a little bit like that. So it's a little bit more niche than other programs. But there are other things you should be looking for at institutions, and so funding is one of them. And you should be so excellent that they want to have you and will support you in a way that is sustainable and doesn't put you in a situation of harm or risk. There's enough of that backed into the arduous nature of the PhD process that it doesn't need to be there. So that's part of the preparing yourself and preparing in advance and making sure you're an exceptional writer and have an exceptional package. And you don't ask recommendations 6 weeks before, you ask them 6 months before. Really, that's the kind of work that really leads to a package being super successful. And you establish relationships. But there's some other things to ask. If you are not just going to be writing, but you're going to be a teacher, Does the graduate program offer you any resources for developing your pedagogical capacity? Being trained as an academic is not the same thing as being trained as a good teacher. I'm assuming many people have had horrible teachers, hopefully none present company excluded, but but because you don't actually get trained within the confines of the discipline, so ask, do you have some place called Centers for Teaching and Learning Development, where you can go and learn how to make a syllabus, go and learn how to write a conference proposal, go and learn how to do grading and use rubrics so that you're not bringing implicit bias into the classroom in your grading, right? Some places have that. Do you have funding for conferences? Do you have people, will professors meet with us and do mock interviews when we're getting ready to go on the market? Some institutions have those as formalized processes, and they're all really important elements of the process to take into account when you're thinking of the package that's being offered to you. Because if it's a package that includes a table of 12 of your professors sitting around and grilling you like you would be grilled at AAR when you go for your first jobs, that's a very valuable asset. It will prepare you. Will someone look at your CV? Will someone look at your statement of teaching philosophy? These are things that we don't always think about, but they're actually the things that translate into you being marketable and competitive on a job market later. There's other things to ask about. And you should be asking them and getting to know the institutions.
All right. We might have time for maybe one or two other questions. We don't have to have any, but if not, we can get ready for dinner.
So the plan for dinner is to move to 205, which is just next door here. It's late. Some people probably have to travel far away to go back home. If you can't wait, it's fine. But please get some food before you leave. And to as many that can wait, let's just regroup in 205.
Before we transition, though, let's give our professors and administration a round of applause.